Samakosa. Aha. Simbana tangadiwo. Umbusa tangana. Samakosa.
All right. Well, welcome back. I agree with Aishwarya. The music is fantastic. So big thanks to the playlist. Come early to the next session so you can come jam out with us. And that's the way to do it. Well, folks, again, my name is Miguel Sosa. It's a pleasure to be your MC for today, and I'm excited to welcome you back to our second session. I hope you all had a great time at the networking session. Don't worry, there are going to be some more opportunities for that later after this. I'd like to also thank again Slalom for being our title sponsor. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you so much for your support. Before we get started on the second session, we're going to hear directly from the CEO and founder of Community Energy Labs. It's an up-and-coming climate startup that has received support from VertueLab in myriad of ways. I'm happy to introduce Tanya Barham of Community Energy Labs.
Hi, Tanya. We would love if you would introduce yourself and Community Energy Labs and share a little bit about what inspired you to do this work.
Well, thank you. My name's Tanya, as you noted. Really excited to talk to you today. Community Energy Labs is a little bit like what Tesla did for electric vehicles. We're trying to galvanize the world around a vision for clean, affordable, and self-driving buildings so that communities can achieve their decarbonization goals by 2030. It's a big job. So we have created a concept around AI-powered clean building control. And that's what we work on. Well, my inspiration from it came from working for a nonprofit between 2016 and 2019, as well as for utilities, in utilities, with utilities, and with communities. And what we found is that many communities were, they had some understanding about solar, they had some understanding about batteries, they might have heard about microgrids, but there was this missing layer of controls and software, which could much more affordably help us squeeze more decarbonization and flexibility out of our energy supply. And in that time at PECI, which was the nonprofit, we saw that there was huge pent-up demand for this solution. And so in 2020, between 2019 and 2020, I spun up Community Energy Labs and transferred that intellectual property to us. And now we're really happy to be working with a lot of, I would say, organizations that have helped incubate and support our passion and turn it into a real business. Organizations like VertueLab.
That's awesome. Can you share a little bit more about how you were connected with VertueLab and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. Community Energy Labs is a remote organization. So we have folks in California, Oregon, and Texas. But I've been in Portland myself for 20 years, even before VertueLab was VertueLab, when it was Oregon Best. And I was always really impressed with the way that the organization supported early innovators in these really complex, either hard sciences or sustainability. And really, it's a very difficult journey to take a science-based, STEM-based innovation and, nurture and incubate that technology all the way to commercial success. Having worked on, through the early 2000s, having worked on incubating and commercializing a number of different energy technologies myself, Oregon Best was always part of that ecosystem. And so when I personally became the person in need of that wraparound support, it was the first place that I went. So at that time, I reached out to Vanessa Margolis, who is just fantastic. And since then, I feel like I've been passed around. CEL has benefited so much from just the breadth and the depth of VertueLab's expertise. We've worked with Trisha Clemens, who was really fantastic on creating sort of affinity groups in female and non-binary STEM founders to give us that kind of support and, help us face some of the obstacles that are unique to that demographic. VertueLab and Trisha also helped us screen a summer intern who was just fantastic, and VertueLab paid for that through a grant program that we applied for. Vanessa has introduced us to a number of different business coaches who helped us with our pitch and our business development, and Leon, of course, Leon with SBIR helped us with our very first SBIR application, and we won. So we are performing. Our early funding came from an SBIR award. So there's just almost not enough good I can say about VertueLab. And in the brief time that we've actually even been in business, they've just been huge supporters, and it's been wonderful to feel them in our corner.
One last question, Tanya. What would you say to our audience about how they can help in the climate fight?
Oh, wow. So many ways to help. I mean, all of us can put a climate and an equity lens on almost anything that we're doing. If you're a funder, can you support entrepreneurs, nonprofits that are working in this space, technologists, in extending that runway so that they have time to test their algorithms, to test their hardware, to test their business models, and to make sure that that vessel is truly seaworthy by the time it needs to go to market. Other things that I think people can do are think about what transferable skills you have. It's not just technologists. We need business people. We need people who can talk to kids. We need people who can talk to seniors. We need people who can speak Spanish. We need people who can speak Arabic, who can help spread the message in our communities. And so think about whether or not there's a role for you in a climate startup or a climate company, and whether or not you would be willing to come on as an early employee. It doesn't require some of the risks, but it does mean, are you able to move things along because you're using your skills and talents in a transferable way on something climate related? We're always looking for great talent at CEL. And then I think last but not least, spread good science, spread ideas and solutions in your social media, help promote and amplify the work of innovators like those supported by VertueLab and beyond. And think consciously, of course, all of us should think consciously about how we're consuming, when we're driving, what we're wasting, what we're consuming, and whether we can just consume a little bit less and support each other a little bit more. So thank you so much. I think there are a lot of different ways that we can get involved, and I look forward to interacting with everyone in our community.
Thank you so much, Tanya. We're so inspired by you and everything that you're doing at Community Energy Labs.
Well, that's ditto.
Great to hear from Tanya, and thank you, Aaron, for bringing that to us. Their story and how VertueLab has supported them is very inspiring to me. And you can learn more about Community Energy Labs and the great work the company is doing in tomorrow's Solutionary Showcase. So don't miss that one. It's going to be a good one. Big shout out to Aaron, Cassidy, Trisha, Joe, and all of the fantastic team at VertueLab for their support in putting together this wonderful session and other sessions throughout the next couple of sessions down the road. And if you want to support companies such as Community Energy Labs, you can make a tax-deductible donation to VertueLab to support their entrepreneur programs. You can donate directly via the link in the chat. It should be showing up right down there. Or you can give by texting. Those instructions are going to be placed in the chat right now. Through the magic of getting the host. There it is. Perfect. Thank you. Now, let's get on to the second session of the day. For this session, we have staff from VertueLab and Clean Energy Ventures tackling the tricky subject of measuring the impact of climate technologies. These two organizations have been laser focused on ensuring that the companies they invest in have meaningful and measurable impact on the environment. And both organizations have created and honed their own measurement and management procedures. And today, they're going to let us take a walk behind the curtain so that you can better communicate climate impact to your customers, investors, and stakeholders. And for this session, I'm going to hand it off to my dear friend, Joe Brickman, to help facilitate the conversation. Joe, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miguel. It's wonderful to have you on the board. Your leadership has been so appreciated. Before I bring up my colleagues, I'm going to provide a little bit more background and context for this work and why we're having this presentation today. I'll start by saying, as we go, please go ahead and put any questions you might have into the chat, and we'll monitor those as they come in and do our best to address them. We're going to approach this as a bit of a conversation, so we'll be looking at that as we go. I'm Joe Brickman, Deputy Director and Director of Impact Strategy at VertueLab. I've been with the organization for 11 years, and so that's not been my title the entire time. I've had a lot of different roles. And when I started with the organization, we were called Oregon Best, and we were primarily founded as a economic development organization working within the space of clean tech. And as a result, our performance metrics were really aligned with those outcomes. Of course, having an environmental impact in a positive way was front and center for our organization, but it was really challenging with the breadth of technologies that we were supporting and dealing with to measure using one language exactly how much impact we were having as an organization, in the same way that we were measuring, jobs growth and follow-on investments and those kinds of things that are much more consistent across company types. In about 2016, I began to inquire into what kind of best practices there might be around doing this kind of work and in providing actual evidence of the impact of environmental technologies and the social benefits as well as environmental benefits in the same kind of rigor as we were doing with the economic benefits. There's all kinds of different reasons to do that, and we're going to talk through that today. Once we figured out what our strategy was going to be for measuring, I recruited my colleague Tricia Clemens, who's here with us, to join me in that effort about a year ago, leveraging her background in chemistry and her shared love for spreadsheets, because spreadsheets are inevitably a part of this work. And she and I have been co-creating our process for coaching companies through estimating their climate impact. Impact measurement and management in climate tech investing is truly an emerging practice. We're building it as we go, and it's been an iterative process and one where we've learned together with our peers that are also looking for the potential for future impact. Speaking of our peers, I'm joined here today not only by Tricia, but by Ted Dillon and Shanbor Gupta, both from Clean Energy Ventures. I'm so happy that they could join us. The genesis of this panel was actually just a conversation that we were having that we just got engrossed in and thought, I think our audience would really appreciate hearing what some of these experiences can tell them about measurement of impact. And so Ted, in our conversations leading up to today, it sounded as though Clean Energy Ventures has had a similar path to the one I described, in the sense that we've always evaluated a startup technology's ability to have impact, but now the measurement is more formal and quantified than ever before. And can you tell us a bit more about that journey and how you arrived at your particular impact thresholds?
Absolutely. So Clean Energy Ventures, we invest in early stage climate tech technologies, pretty broadly defined. So we're investing in things from, coatings for solar panels to increase efficiency, to advanced carbon fibers that are thermally conductive and allow lightweighting in aerospace and automotive. And our founders have been working in this space for a long time, right? They've basically been working in clean tech since the clean tech term was coined in the early 2000s. And I think that was out of a recognition that climate change was a problem and needed to be addressed through greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I think they spent the first decade of their time in the investments career, after being seasoned entrepreneurs or running large companies or divisions of large companies, really focused on how to get those technologies from their initial stage to commercialization, right? So taking them from the lab to something much larger. And I think along that journey, what's needed to support those organizations has changed a lot. But I think the underlying philosophy of being able to commercialize clean energy technologies so they can have an impact has been the same. And I think early on, when Clean Energy Ventures was founded, we were doing a lot of thinking about that in spreadsheets, and we wanted to come up with a thesis for how much impact we thought we could have, right? I don't think there are many venture capital firms out there, and certainly weren't when our fund closed in 2019, our second close, that had a number they were targeting, right? Or held companies towards reaching a number. And what our founders, our managing directors, basically did is said, they looked at the agreements, basically what is our carbon budget between now and 2050 in order to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius in temperature change. And there's about 1,200 gigatons. But then when you look at the commitments made by governments across the country, across the globe, you find that really we only get about 700 of those gigatons saved by those companies, right? And there's a huge delta. There's a 600 or 700 gigaton delta that we need to take out of the economy in some other way beyond what governments have promised. And so our founders looked at that and said, can we put our $110 million to work at a lot bigger threshold than we might normally expect. Can we swing big? And the number we came away with is if we can get every one of our portfolio companies to potentially mitigate 2.5 gigatons of CO2 between now and 2050, with about 20, 25 portfolio companies, we can take about 62 gigatons out of the delta between what global governments have committed and what we actually need to achieve in order to stay below 1.5 C. So that's how we got to our number. And ever since, we've been very much using that number and had to create the tools and all the things around it in order to hold our own feet to the fire and measure our portfolio companies appropriately. I mean, well, what do you think about, Joe or Trisha? When are you thinking about meaningful? So for us, it was very much about where Paris is going and how we can have an impact with the dollars our investors have given us while also providing them a return. I mean, what does it mean for like the VertueLab's Climate Impact Fund?
Yeah, I think we had a very similar process. I think our benchmark that we turned to was the IPCC and their report on, how much mitigation is going to need to take place and how much of that could be delivered by technological innovation. And then further, how much of that was really early stage innovation. And so kind of, in progressive steps, narrowing down to the place where VertueLab really plays. What's our strong suit, and that's how we came up with our targets. We don't have a named threshold in our case, so what we're looking at is really the breadth of things that are coming through our pipeline and evaluating which ones have the greatest potential for impact from the ones that are crossing our desk. So we are looking at, of course, the technology's potential for impact as alongside, the team strength and diversity kinds of questions as well. So there's sort of more holistic picture, but that the climate piece is key among them as the climate impact fund. So
I'm curious, how did you think about the investor perspective in that? So, your investors differ from ours to some degree. I mean, how did you bake in those considerations? What were their priorities and concerns? How does that all become part of the picture?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for us, it's the thesis of our climate impact fund to show that the philanthropic dollars that are invested in us have a direct impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that we're looking at priming our companies for future investment from downstream investors that have those kinds of expectations from their LPs and others. So having our companies, excel at predicting their climate impact and talking about that story, telling that story is going to set them up for success in that respect. So how about with you? Are you also looking at the downstream investment perspective?
I very much so. I mean, I think we're trying to consider how do we measure over time, knowing that growth stage investors will want to see a much more dollar per gigaton, how they can do offsets when they get later into the process. It's also interesting that we're a traditional venture capital firm, as in our LPs expect venture capital grade returns on their investments, and that I think that's being more talked about in the last 4 or 6 months as a lot more money is coming into climate tech. But at large, and particularly when we were doing our initial fundraising, the idea of getting top grade venture capital returns and meaningfully impacting emissions at the same time was kind of a foreign concept, right? It was the expected and trusted and reliable model was much more closer to the one you're talking about. How far can my philanthropic dollars go? And I think where we've kind of seen things going differently is, is there an opportunity for us to commercialize these technologies, see a return for our investors, and know that those technologies are going to go on to do very big things as far as mitigating climate change. And that, I think that comes out of the philosophy that those two pieces are actually inextricably tied as we move forward in the future, that the companies that can reduce more greenhouse gases will in fact be more profitable, and the most profitable companies will be the ones that can prove they can reduce more greenhouse gases.
It's certainly played out in a recession, right? The companies have stood the test of time much greater when they've had really strong ESG. So Shambhur and Trisha, you're regularly in conversation with startups and helping them through the challenges of forecasting their impact. We haven't even really touched on yet what a sort of art and science that work is, and so many unknowns and assumptions that have to be navigated with companies that are at this early of a stage in the course of doing that forecasting work. Given how messy that process can be, what do you hear from companies in terms of the value proposition for them in going through the process?
Trisha, why don't you start, and then I'll add our perspective.
All right, perfect. Yeah. Well, on top of what was already covered, especially with that downstream investor perspective, just as I've worked with companies and we've helped them model that, I've seen their pitch decks show up different, even as we've worked with them, and it shows up where that number, that forecasting wasn't present before. So that's been cool, and I think it's neat for them to see the value in that. And then they also, even in their business to business connections, as they're doing their customer discovery, I think sometimes they're finding in that being able to communicate the potential for impact to their customers has really started to show up, because those folks are going to be having those ESG goals. They need to be able to articulate that then to their customers, and that's showing up there. And then I would say, this is some of the difficulty too, and Shampur, I'm sure that you'll agree that we talked about this in those initial conversations. This is a very different way for them to think about their forecasts, about where their business model. Most folks are usually talking about the financials and the dollar amounts, and so this is where we're really looking at translating that into emissions reduction potential over time. So that's tricky, but again, it makes their story and their pitch just so much more robust. Mm-hmm. Shampur, I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot about helping the entrepreneur understand their place in the world and how their company can have an impact, and that exercise is useful not just from an emissions and analysis point of view, but also understanding different revenue streams, different business models that might be more effective, or might be other paths to having impact. And one of the ways that we kind of cement this in reality, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, is we, as Ted mentioned, we look at it really in tied with financial returns. So we look at at their pro forma in conjunction with how much a company plans to do in terms of emissions reductions. It's the basis for assumptions have to be in the same ballpark, and in the same line of sight, so that we can that it's logical and it makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
We just got a great timely question in the chat. It's always good at the beginning to sort of level set on terminology. Richard Hartung is asking about some of the terminology around greenhouse gases, emissions, and what metrics in particular we're using. It's talking about, we're talking about CO2, methane, water usage, and then further, it's how can startups measure it easily when their key focus is on scaling the business? I think that second question we're going to be talking about for most of this panel. So let's just answer the metric question first. Shampur, would you speak to your take on what we're talking about when we're talking about the units that we're talking about from an emissions perspective?
So yeah, I agree that greenhouse gases and emissions and are generally conflated or thrown around a lot, and it's always helpful to establish a firm metric. How we tend to look at it is in terms of emissions, in terms of CO2 equivalent, and I think that's the carbon accounting that Ted referenced of how our founders looked at it in that carbon budget. And that's kind of why we created the Circ tool to essentially give entrepreneurs a simple tool to try and help calculate based on some simple metrics of this is your revenue, this is your unit impact, and these are your this is your growth plan, and this is the potential for impact that you can have.
Right. So specifically like methane or nitrous oxide or other greenhouse gases, there's conversions that allow you to say, what's the CO2 equivalent of that? And so when we're talking about 2.5 gigatons, we're talking about CO2 equivalent. So hopefully that answers
Absolutely.
folks' questions about the metric we're talking about, because there are so many different pathways to emissions reduction and greenhouse gas emissions reduction that you need to be able to weave in a lot of different pathways in one figure that's comparable across different technology types. And that was kind of the challenge that I was bringing up at the top of this session, which is that when you're dealing with, a water technology over here and a, energy storage technology over here and, a electric charging station, a vehicle charging station over here, three very different things, all of which can have a significant positive impact as a climate solution, but they aren't necessarily measured in the same way. So thanks for that. The other thing I'd want to say here is if there are any additional motivations for doing this kind of work that either you can think of or you've experienced, go ahead and put those in the chat. We can talk through those as well. All right. Shambor, what have you learned from your work with companies about how to support their approach to forecasting impact? I mean, this is the how do you make it easier for companies thing that Richard was asking about. And this is kind of the crux question here. Yeah,
and to that point, as I mentioned before, that's one of the main motivations as to why we created the Circ tool. And that's essentially one of the motivations was to increase awareness within the entire ecosystem of, how do I go about measuring this? What's a logical framework for me thinking through the impact that my company can have from an entrepreneurial perspective, and then also having a way to level set and see, across different companies, what are the kinds of impact people are having, and what are different industries seeing. And that's really the other real motivation for the tool was I think on trying to put in place, or at least put out a standard of some sort, to at least get the conversation going towards a standard of some sort, and of how we can do that measurement, because it is varied, to say the least. There are lots of different approaches. Do you view the Circ tool as sort of like the first step in collaboration with you? I mean, how does that work? Yeah, it's just essentially meant to be a screening tool for us. We get I don't know how many applications now there, but it's close to the thousands, and it's just having the bandwidth of trying to go through each application in detail and understanding the modeling of that. It's really tough to go into that deep dive. So this was meant to give a kind of platform. And how we also want to think about it is that it's an order of magnitude number. It's a very simple calculation in terms of the approach and the questions we're asking, of how many units are you going to sell is one type of question, and the other type of question is how much of an impact does each unit have, essentially, whether it's energy reduced from the grid or from tons of carbon reduced. And it's using that and plotting it to an S curve and adoption curve through the different means and algorithm we have. But it's not going to be accurate because it's a 30-year prediction. So it's that's why I said it's meant to be an order of magnitude initial screening, how we kind of set up the conversation to really deep dive during diligence.
And we're also trying to meet entrepreneurs where they are. So, the companies that we're investing in are 4 or 5 people that might be coming out of a national lab or an accelerator or otherwise. Maybe they've, stumbled into a first customer through their network, but they've got a lot of things going on, right? And every company that applies to Clean Energy Ventures applies through our website because we have a significant volume. And so we've just basically embedded our GHG calculator circ into that online application. It's only 6 questions, as Shambor mentions. And we designed it specifically to be able to be completed with information that most entrepreneurs have on hand when they're thinking about raising funds. So, we're asking it, Shambor can go to a lot more detail in the questions and how they think about that better than I can. But all I was to say is we're trying to meet them where they are, because we think it's important to be able to use a screening tool that can be order of magnitude accurate, but can also be fairly expeditiously done because we have such a volume. But that's certainly not the end of the journey, right?
Yeah. And Trisha, I mean, you've worked with dozens of companies now with our process, and we similarly break things down. Of course, we don't have a software that we're using on the front end for our customers or clients to engage in, but what have you learned in some of those conversations about what companies need and how we approach this process?
Yeah, and there's just so much to build off what Shambor and Ted was just saying too. I just heard so many parallels, and I understand kind of the pain point of wanting to be able to assist these companies, and so many of them coming through this, and just our own bandwidth, obviously, as an organization to be able to provide that assistance. But we'll talk more about some of the other tools, but like the tool that you guys have, is definitely valuable. We've leaned on Crane quite a bit as well, and being able to build off of that. But and Shambor, you were mentioning just kind of around that functional unit, and I know that you guys have in your Q&A or FAQs that you kind of tackle that. And I think as Joe and I have dove into this, that is one of the hardest things for folks to get into. And really kind of narrow down. And I guess, so yeah, when Joe was talking about kind of the art and science of this, that tends to be sometimes where we have spent a bit of time, that it takes a while to get into that. And so I guess what I'm saying when I talk about that functional unit is really being able to look at where the impact is going to be made, where the emission reduction potential is going to be made based off of the product that is sold. And so again, you kind of go, well, what the heck even does that mean? And so we'll look at like energy reduction or energy intensity per square foot of like air circulated, like if we're looking at building efficiency. If we're looking at, say, electric vehicles and a technology there, we're going to end up looking at how many miles a vehicle potentially travels over time on that, and what's the emission reduction compared to a fossil fuel like combustion engine situation. So we have to get those two, what we're comparing on the business as usual side and their technology, we have to get that on the same language and comparing the same unit. And sometimes there's a bit of math and trickery and getting to that point to where then we can start to look at, okay, based on your pro forma, on units sold over time, and again, over that, yes, 30-year forecast, what does that calculate out to as far as emissions reduction over time? And again, yeah, we're also kind of just looking for that order of magnitude.
Yeah, and at this point, we're talking about a forward-looking forecast. And even 4 or 5 years ago, organizations that were doing clean tech investing were not necessarily doing that. They were using more of a, yes, this has impact, or no, this doesn't have impact, and then waiting until after the investment was done to do any measurement of actual impact that was made. And I think that the efforts that we're talking about here are really aimed toward doing that more forward-looking piece to guide our investments so that we can be more responsible as climate impact investors. And I think that that's one of the things that I think when I look at Richard's question, the thing that's, when we think about measuring impact post-investment, sometimes I think people have in their mind, sensors out in the field measuring, how many emissions are resulting. We're talking about scaling things that were measured either in a lab or in a proof of concept or prototype or a demonstration project. Initially, you have demonstration that this is how much more efficient or how many fewer emissions are created through this product or process innovation, and then using math essentially to scale that out to what would happen at scale. So there's a lot of, as we keep talking about, some of assumptions about how many products you think you can see put into the market over the lifetime of or over the 30-year lifespan, and how much impact that can have. So that's why we're talking about this order of magnitude piece, right? Let's talk a little bit about like why we do that. Like, at what point do we stop getting into sort of the specifics? Do we just keep going? And where do we say enough is enough in terms of getting down into the weeds with some of the estimates?
So I could take a quick crack at that, and please chime in. But essentially, what we're really looking to see is, what are the assumptions you've made? What is the logic that you've built into your model, like into your thought process of when you're arriving at that number, rather than the number itself, really? As we mentioned, the order of magnitude, but it's more about, do we believe the assumptions? Are they reasonable? Are they, can they logically happen? Do we see that happening based on the, on a number of factors, the strength of the team, the strength of the technology, etc. And that's how we really like to think of it, rather than saying it's a 2.5 versus a 2.2. That's not, we're going to be off. Whatever the number is that's going to be on the screen is going to be different in 30 years. So it's more about how credibly, with a straight face, can we tell the people who are LPs and our network and the broader community that this is why we invested in the company, and this is why we believe they can achieve those emissions reduction.
I think for me, when I've jumped in on these and been working pretty closely with the teams, it's really kind of when I start seeing sort of diminishing returns, when I kind of test the sensitivity in the model of it. Is things I know for them, and some of it for us leading through with these folks is really kind of trying to help them navigate and not look at really super detailed things. I think, oh, well, there's this part, that's going to maybe and make a difference. But sometimes when we get into it, it's actually very nominal differences. And yeah, Shambur, like what you're talking about, just making sure that model makes logical sense. There's not big pieces missing out of the picture of it. But yeah, when we start to see those diminishing returns, or you put a test to it and we're only looking at that order of magnitude changing by, just a couple megatons here or there, then we know sort of that model is maybe in the ballpark. Or if we look at a rather aggressive adoption scenario versus a very conservative, and what is the difference in that? And once the model is kind of built, you can play with those numbers. And that kind of gives that range that I think then that's where we know we're in the money.
I also tend to see a lot of like rabbit holing on this, right? So if you're planting trees, you're thinking about second order and third order effects, like the emissions to truck the trees to plant them, and then the fertilizer needed to take the trees from seed to sapling. And you can take these things to the nines. And I think our larger point is, and I don't know what I'm having for dinner tonight, and that's in only just a couple hours. So it's hard to predict how these things will play out and all the variables that will change. And what we're really just trying to understand is this going to be a net positive effect? And what's the order of magnitude scale of those things? And I agree, is once you start to get down the rabbit hole, the sensitivity analyses get really out of whack quite quickly.
Yeah, and that can make things tricky, especially when people are really in love with their technology, and they're rightly so, because the technology is amazing. They can struggle sometimes. We've had conversations sometimes where the innovator will really want to explore. They'll want to go down those rabbit holes because the details really matter to them. And so there's often a very sensitive conversation where we have to say, yeah, it matters, but for this conversation, we're just going to take a step back and look at where's the biggest potential for impact, and how can we get a really credible estimate there, and focus our energy around getting a credible number using external third-party data to support those claims, or even direct evidence of your own product's performance, to just really nail that figure down so that we can feel really confident about that one big piece. I think that's, you know, for me, I get excited when we can get to that. And then, you know, the other pieces are, you know, like a cherry on top. You can, you know, get that later on. And the other point to make about that is that often these companies are at a stage when then their technology is still evolving a lot. And so when there's these kind of comings and goings in terms of the elements within their own product or technology might shift, that could really impact their life cycle, the impact of their technology over their life cycle significantly. And so there's a question here in the Q&A that I thought would be good for us to tackle at this point. Ian Adams from Clean Energy Trust, who when I put in the chat here that link to the Crane tool that was brought up. Clean Energy Trust was involved in the creation of the Crane tool. He asks, how do your organizations think about valuing or evaluating the impact of solutions that are climate positive, but don't convert into CO2 equivalents easily, such as a platform to help assess climate risk or water resource sustainability, for example? I'm going to turn to Clean Energy Ventures for that one.
Yeah, I'll start then, and please back me up wherever I, you know, misspeak. But this is essentially, you know, the toughest part of the job, I think, in terms of enabling technologies and you know, and how do we measure the impact of those, and particularly when it's even further removed and it's an enabler of an enabler, and then, you know, you get into these twice removed things. But I think you look at the end result, at least that's how I tend to look at it, is what is the net change that technology is enabling. You know, if there is, as you said, water sustainability, what kind of change does that mean in terms of trucking of water or transportation of water, or, you know, treatment of water, and look at that change and try to quantify that, and then say, you know, there is some kind of credit that can be you know, you were responsible for some portion of that, or enabling that portion of that, and make your best logical case. There is not going to be a perfect science of saying, but if you start saying I enabled 100% of that, it's going to be less likely to be believed. But if you say something like, you know, there's a good portion of this, and, you know, 20% or 50% is directly as a result of my product or technology or service, I think that's something that we have to kind of consider. And
yeah, right. I think what I'm going to just put a emphasis on that, you know, the taking a conservative mindset to not feel as though you need to take all the credit for all the things, but that, you know, if there's any way to find a credible third-party source that says, you know, you can attribute this much impact to this, you know, the contribution of this enabling technology, that always helps, and to be able to have that kind of credible third-party source. Yeah, I think enabling technologies are really tricky. And Ian, thank you for asking that question, because I think that there are other pieces that I don't think we're going to get into today, but I think are a really important part of the longer-term conversation around, you know, aside from mitigating climate change, how do we adapt to and stay resilient to climate change? There's a ton of technologies that are going to be needed for that. And I think we really are in a thinking space around that at VertueLab, around what's our role in helping to fuel the resilience to the climate change that we're already seeing take place, right? So, so there's that. We've talked a little bit about tools and approaches, and we've talked about the Simple Emissions Reduction Calculator, or CERC, that Clean Energy Ventures created. We've talked about Crane, which that link is available there. There's a tool that VertueLab uses that it's really just what we use internally to guide people through, and often when we are working with companies, we're adapting that as we go. So it's a little bit less universally applicable than CERC is. And then sometimes we're using forecasts that companies build themselves, and then there's life cycle assessment. How and when do you apply these different tools in your practice, Ted and Shambor?
So Circ, we really put in more for screening and just setting up that initial conversation, because apart from the numerical inputs into Circ, there's a question of that there's a space where the entrepreneur can justify and explain their reasoning and their logic, and that is a really good entry point into the entire discussion, and a good setup for going into deeper diligence. And in deeper diligence is when it's still a lot more customized and a much more crafted approach to each and every individual company, just because I do think that every company is quite unique and different, and the way they approach and their models, etc., and their technologies. So you have to kind of build it to reflect that. You obviously use third-party sources where possible, and to supplement the inputs that go into it, and some of which can come from an LCA if the company has that. But there's just a lot of the companies we look at are so early stage in that an LCA might not be something they can do because it's expensive and it's time consuming and difficult to do. And if they have it, great, but if they don't, there's a lot that's going to change with that company in the next 5-10 years, whether it's about their technology, their processes, etc., that the LCA might have to change. And so we have to take each one with a grain of salt.
Right. And it's an expensive process at such an early stage. What kind how about you, Tricia? I know your process, but tell the folks in the webinar here about how you tap these different tools at different times.
And I mean, initially, even when folks approach us, to be a fund applicant, we're asking the question as far as their climate impact, and just kind of looking for that initial thought on, even if it's a kind of a climate impact statement as to how their technology is going to reduce emissions. And it's just to put out the feelers as to, have they done any thinking around this? We are still evolving in our process, and as Joe mentioned, our tool is internal facing. We do hope to kind of evolve into a way that then it kind of to help lead them through some of these tools. I mentioned, Crane has been a tool for us to point folks to, but that can be limited by if their technology is in there. Even if the technology is sort of captured in there, we still take a deeper look at what those assumptions are behind in Crane, because sometimes the market is that 100% overtime capture. And Shambor, like what you mentioned, it's like, well, then what is when you look at those recommendations, how does that resonate with you? And so that's in our diligence, that's kind of that deeper dive we take with them. I do want to kind of, I guess, say too, on the tool front of things, and just to acknowledge in case there's anybody tuning in that are also fellow analysts and in part of this picture, there is an argument because of this, the ability for each team to be complicated and to go down into the rabbit holes. There is an argument to have sort of this common outward facing tool or methodology that we can all sort of tap into and consider and point companies towards, since wherever we all are kind of on the spectrum, this is a very valuable story for folks to be able to tell. So there is that work being done, and Crane is kind of leading that. Prime Coalition is leading some conversation around there, and each of us are part of those conversations and that long-term thinking. But yeah, that's kind of the two sides of the tool. That answers the question there.
So sort of on the flip side, so these are some of the tools that we're using when you get into conversations with companies about the information that they've submitted. What are some of the red flags that cause you to question what somebody is claiming as their emissions reduction potential? Anyone?
I could start. Just as we kind of pointed out earlier, when the adoption is at 100% of the market, or over 100%, or just some insanely high number that no matter how much you suspend disbelief, that's a tough number to swallow. And so really trying to focus on what is reasonable in terms of adoption, in terms of scaling up. What do you think you're going to go, or in terms of the impact that you take credit for, like we also discussed. I think that's they're similar, related, but it's again, it's a tough. There are a lot of those kinds of fallacies that people tend to fall into. I don't know about you, Trisha, but is it the
Yeah,
same?
but it's along that same line. I think that's where the flag maybe starts to show up, and it mostly showing up as far as their kind of customer discovery business model type conversation. If they haven't looked into segmentation or what their beachhead markets are going to be, and they haven't done a whole lot of thinking and discovery there, then that is going to where I see it shows up in this modeling. That then there's a little bit of crickets when we start trying to figure out, like, all right, how do we dissect this? So that it kind of goes in parallel. It sort of echoes what you were saying there.
Yeah, I'm thinking the other sort of distinction that I wanted to bring up here. I don't know that we've talked about this much, but in conversations with folks in similar roles in other organizations, it's clear that we haven't harmonized around a particular approach to what the emissions reduction potential number really represents. I think that your organization and ours are similar in that we're looking at how much this particular company can expect to achieve between now and 2050. There are a number of different ways that other organizations and investors are looking at this, including the entire market and that whole segment, what their emissions reduction potential is, so that that you're taking out of the equation that you sort of attempt to figure out what percentage of the market this company is going to impact. I'd be curious to hear some of you talk about that, and if there are other sorts of takes on that distinct, other ways that people are looking at this that you're aware of, that would be helpful for our audience to be thinking about.
One of the things I can definitely say about, how do we think about this on a long-term perspective, or how do we think about portfolio companies making good on these numbers, is it's hard to predict the future, but we have a philosophy about how these technologies will scale and get to market that is changing a little bit, but by and large, it's through acquisition. So when we look at an assessment and look at an ERP and say, we think this company is going to mitigate 2.5 gigatons, well, we're going to be there mentoring them and supporting them for 5 or 7 years or so, right? At which point, because we're a venture capital firm, we're going to expect some point of exit. And the point of that is twofold. One is to give a return to our investors. Two is because often enough, especially in the clean energy space, really disrupting a market at a foundational level in energy is quite hard because of reliability of the grid, because of existing infrastructure, because the speed at which some of these players move. It's a lot different than you might find in big tech in Silicon Valley, for example. So we actually expect most of the emissions reduction potentials of our companies to come, in many cases, after they've been acquired. By, if we can take a smart metering technology for emerging markets that's growing like gangbusters, and that gets acquired by a global meter provider that can distribute that technology at 3x the rate in 24 months, that's the type of thing that we're actually hoping for and looking for. But it's very hard to calculate and it's very hard to predict. So I think it's just an interesting part of the challenge.
Yeah, and there's actually a question in the Q&A here that addresses that. Given that current policies are very likely insufficient to drive rapid enough adoption of climate tech, how do you factor in the evolving political and economic environment, for example, increasing carbon pricing when predicting the scale of adoption of a specific technology?
Yeah, exactly. And like we give the portfolio company the benefit of the doubt, and at least in our screening processes, right? So, the carbon intensity of the grid, depending on where you are and where you are in time, and we know it's going to change, right? But we choose to hold it stable where it is today during our screening process because we want that order of magnitude, and we want to give the entrepreneur the benefit of the doubt on how they're going to be able to improve the status quo. I think to me, it's part of that rabbit hole where we want you to be precise and thoughtful, but at some point we're navel gazing rather than taking action, and we need to be taking action.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Looks like we have another question here, and it actually is a good sort of segue into the next piece that we wanted to talk about, and that's kind of how we move into management of impact. Aside from storytelling, do these metrics act as a feedback for companies to adjust the operation model, technology, or human resources? In other words, other than impact measurement, do we have examples of monitoring measurement? Or that's what I think of when I think of IMM, impact measurement and management. Impact management side of things is that feedback loop. So let's talk a little bit about that and how you think about that at Clean Energy Ventures, and even I'm going to also say even within the measurement piece, how much feedback loop is there in the early stages of a company going through this process?
So I don't know. It might be a good time to talk about Nth, Ted, because that's a perfect example of the how this process directly changed their operation model. So when they first applied to us, this is a company that addresses battery recycling and has a patent technology around that. When they first applied to us, their primary focus on impact was, they submitted and they had their focus was on how EV adoption would increase greatly because as a result of battery recycling. And while we thought, yes, that's a positive increase, we really drilled down, we looked at the way that they were affecting it, and some of the assumptions were quite aggressive. And we wanted to have that conversation of what have you, why have you assumed the things that you do? Where else can this be applied? What are the other kinds of impact you haven't really considered? And in the process of that discussion, we found that that their technology applies not just to cobalt and nickel, which is in batteries, but to much broader metals, across the spectrum. And the scale of their impact and the scale of their business model, increased dramatically. So I think that's a real life example of where, and selfishly we try and think that kind of noticeable change would not have happened as quickly, or maybe not at all, if we hadn't had that conversation about about impact and where they see themselves playing and how they can how that business model fits into that. So I don't know, Ted, if you want to add anything to that, but that's essentially one example that I thought was particularly relevant in terms of how the operation model really changed based on based on our impact conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we invested in that company almost a year ago, and you can see it in how they act and operate today, right? So yeah, when they came to us, they were focused on the battery recycling market, and because we opened that aperture together on what minerals they can process, now they equal that message with a message for the mining industry. So they focus on how they can process existing mining waste, which is really where they're going to start to see that much bigger bang for their buck on GHGs. And I agree. I don't think, they may have gotten there, but down the line, and we wouldn't be having them go into market right now with a two-pronged approach if we hadn't discovered the opportunity, both financial and GHG, through the GHG analysis process. Yeah, it's a good one. And we've got other examples like that too. Some that are, for example, in the water space, right? So some people have asked about, secondary effects or other environmental impacts, right? Positives. And so we have a company that does reverse osmosis water filters. They 3D print them directly on the filter rather than having mesh spacers, which what was interesting to us is reduces the energy requirement for reverse osmosis, because they can basically put lower pressure water through a filter. And that was a good story. but what we realized is because of the size and form factor of their technology, that they can distribute it a lot more widely, and if they can do a lot more local reverse osmosis, which reduces trucking emissions. So we found this great story and this great strategy around being able to distribute their technology that actually has a really big knock-on effect on transportation emissions, right? And we've got a couple others too. It's interesting how one parlays into the other, and some of the things you discover when you're focused on a different narrative. And so I think Shanbor and I have thought a lot about your carbon narrative and your business value proposition or your business narrative, which is sometimes quite different. And I think you were talking a lot about this, Trisha, right? That storyline is quite different.
Okay. I definitely have seen a ton of examples, not just in this work, but in my years in sustainable design of buildings. Those unexpected things that you learn when you go into analysis and you look closely at where the impact is really coming from. Sometimes you get really surprised, and those surprises can send you in a completely different direction than you might have otherwise done just based on your own assumptions. And I mean, very well-intentioned, highly educated individuals can make assumptions about where their impacts are coming from, and then be surprised in that process.
Like you might seem to think that the big emissions reduction potential is in the transportation side of things, but actually then you look at a piece of the processing, and kind of goes back to one of the earlier questions, what emissions are we looking at? And especially if you look at the CO2 equivalents and gases that maybe you didn't think were that big of a deal, but when you look at that impact on the climate and on the ozone over time, it's actually a much bigger deal on that. So that can kind of show up when you start asking these questions.
Absolutely. And I think there was another question in here about, I think, or another piece of that question is really around what happens when you get into post investment. How do you work with companies to ensure that they're continuing to have the impact that they want to have, that you want them to have? And I'm going to put another link here in the chat for a resource that I think is really helpful in terms of making a translation between sort of typical accounting processes and or ways of thinking and impact management. Impact management project has done a really good job of sort of laying out sort of a series of questions that one should ask themselves when thinking about their impact. I just think in terms of guiding some thinking around that, it's really helpful. We, at VertueLab, I think by the time we get into tracking the impact of goods sold, a lot of the hard work has been done through the work that Trisha has been talking about, and the work that we've been talking about at Clean Energy Ventures. We're looking to reduce the number of things that companies have to report to us. These are early stage companies, and we're not wanting to burden them with a whole lot in the way of reporting. Already we're asking them about financial aspects in their reporting, but we're trying to find ways to identify the amount of technology that's actually been sold and put into use, and then using the individual products, emissions reduction potential, or ERP, to project how many expected greenhouse gas emissions we can expect to be reduced over the lifetime of that product that's been sold. So again, it's forward looking. I don't think everybody does it that way, but that's the way we're set up to do it. There is actually a global standard for this called greenhouse gas reductions due to products sold. And that is another link that I should probably share. The Global Impact Investing Network, or GIN, has a tool called IRIS, which has sort of cataloged all of the standard accepted impact metrics out there. Oh, thank you. Thank you for putting that in the chat. So the IRIS tool is super valuable in terms of identifying, known, proven, and standardized ways of reporting on particular types of impact. And I think one of the reasons why that's really important to us at VertueLab is that there is greater potential that another investor down the road in our company is going to be asking for a similar thing because it's standardized, and it's more likely that they'll just have that one number that they'll have to report rather than having to have a different report for every single investor that they're working with. So that's one of the things we're thinking about there. What about at Clean Energy Ventures? What are you doing post-investment?
To be honest, we're still trying to answer a lot of those questions. And, partly because when we're focused very heavily on B2B sales, products sold can be small numbers while we're intimately involved with the company. And the impact of those things can be over time and by things that we sometimes can't monitor, right? Particularly like grid technologies. So we're still trying to figure that out. And I think a lot of what we'll probably focus on is how is your ERP changing over time, right? And is your business model adapting? I mean, we are very hands-on investors. We're providing a lot of service and support to our portfolio companies, and we spend more time in diligence. We spend a lot more time supporting to make sure they're successful. So, your ERP is likely to change based on pivots in the business or adjustments to the target market. And what we want to do is just keep making sure that we're testing on our ERP to make sure the potential remains at or improves throughout that process. Shan, anything else to add on that? Or go ahead, Joe.
Oh, I was just going to ask, if there's anything in particular that your LPs want to see from you. Are you asked to report on emissions reduction?
Yeah, so we mostly report on the ERP. So I think our LPs have been educated with kind of the narrative that I've shared there. So they understand that what we're doing is really making sure that critical technologies to decarbonization are making it successfully out of the lab into other larger companies. And they, I think they trust us to be identifying what those critical technologies are and measuring that they're critical, and then being able to shepherd them across that chasm. I think in other ways, our LPs are very excited about these technologies because a lot of them are, large multinational corporations that are looking to disrupt their own value chains, right? So big, oil and gas players that are authentically trying to decarbonize, right? Or, large glass makers or large energy infrastructure players. Those are companies that want to know they have an opportunity to decarbonize through new technologies, and that they have a sight line on that technology just as much, right?
So I'll just invite our audience to continue to submit questions. They've been great so far, so thank you for that interaction. Trisha, you put another link in here about the impacts of food waste.
It's another great tool that actually, one of our supporting companies actually showed me I didn't know existed, and it helps take in some of that initial input and tell a story.
Let's see. So as we're waiting for others to come on here, we talked a few times about Crane, and none of us are involved in the creation of Crane. Obviously, we're not part of those organizations, but I believe we're all users. And I think one thing that would be really important for our audience to know, as it's not been the focus of our conversation, is that one of the things that I believe is a common thread is that the third-party evidence that's underlying sort of the assumptions that are being made. And Trisha pointed at it obliquely, but I wanted to kind of emphasize this. Even if your technology isn't one of the things that's in Crane listed by name, there are ways of leveraging the tool. They have just within the last few months released a new version that allows you to customize, create a new technology type. And so as you're going in there, you can learn more about that. Crane does a good job of Row AI, the software company, offers some regular trainings on how to do that. And they also can provide coaching support for creating those in custom models. The other thing that we often will do is find a similar type of technology or something that's in that same value chain and go into that model and see what the third-party evidence is that's underlying the assumptions, and we'll borrow that data essentially. And that's a wonderful sort of workaround that we've found with that tool, is that because they've done such a good job of vetting the underlying data, that you can count on the quality of that research that's there, and I really appreciate that. they have tapped heavily into the research that was done in support of the book Project Drawdown. And if anybody on this call has not read Project Drawdown or visited the Project Drawdown website, I cannot emphasize strongly enough what a great resource it is, just in terms of the global research that went into setting that up. There's a team of hundreds of researchers that went about identifying the best data underlying the emissions reduction potential of all these different technologies and solutions. So that's just a resource that I would highly recommend. Thank you, Tricia, for putting that in the chat. We look at that to help as just even like a first order of magnitude, like if this technology that we're looking at falls into one of the top most impactful categories of Project Drawdown, we know that it's at least tackling something impact that has the potential for global impact at scale. And the other thing that's really valuable about reading the book or watching some of the presentations about it that you can find on YouTube is the unexpected things that they discovered as they were doing their analysis, the unexpected impacts, that, the fact that educating women and girls was such a significant global impact for the positive for climate was a surprise to them, as well as the impact of agriculture just being far and away more impactful than they expected. So there's a lot of really great learnings in there to sort of check your assumptions around where impacts come from. All right, so we do have one more question here. How should startups position their impact? Customers and investors may focus more on their profitability and long-term results. So for some potential customers, mining companies, for example, talking about sustainability may be a negative, according to one startup. I agree. It's, measuring your impact is not necessarily a marketing exercise. It really depends on who your customers are. I'd love to hear the rest of you panelists talking about that.
Yeah, I think in some cases we have found instances where there are negative impacts when you look at emissions reduction potential and with different ones. And then sometimes the emissions reduction isn't the biggest story. Sometimes it's water reduction. Right now, we're particularly focused on a fund that we want to be able to show those emissions reduction potential over time. To market to your customers or to other investors, if they're looking at other environmental impacts, that might be your story.
Yeah, I would say sustainability and emissions reduction, the market has changed. They're rarely negative values for a customer, right? Yeah. Now, a customer may make a decision predominantly based on cost or based on, improved output or whatever it may be, and sustainability may be a second or a tertiary priority. But I just don't see it as a detractor. Not to be living in a bubble, and I definitely do live in some degree of a bubble. But I think the markets are shifting in a way that the companies who see sustainability as a negative are the ones whose business models and industries are under attack and are diminishing quickly. And so I think when we just as investors consider markets where we want our startups to focus, or the startups we want to invest in the markets that they sell to, it's those markets that are on their way up, not those that are on their way down. So, for example, we don't invest in technologies that would sustain the oil and gas industry, right? Or rely dramatically on the oil and gas industry for their business, as long as that's, if it's decarbonization and pivoting, that's something different. But that's because we believe that those businesses are on their way out, right? And so I think there's that. A, I think you have to have that faith. B, I think it's about the narrative too. So, some organizations are really focused on what their emissions impact is, and you need to have a story in your pocket for what that looks like and where that's the top priority. And at the other end, you need to have a story for when cost and business value are the top priorities. So sometimes those are the same costs, or sometimes they're the same narratives, and sometimes they're different narratives. But I think you'd be tuning to the audience that you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we wrap up here, I want to ask just final thoughts about what kind of advice you would give to a startup company who's embarking on this process of measuring their impact.
So I can start. So it's just, I'd say really, it's an educational process. So you might not have the answer now, but it's important to get engaged. And it's really important to try and try to learn more about the space, just regardless of what end of the spectrum you are on. You can't stop learning, because there's always going to be new technologies, and the way that impact translates into, cost or performance improvements, or just competitive advantage going down the line, is something that we still really haven't explored, and there's just a lot of space for that. And I think it's just going to get more and more important as we go forward.
Ted?
I would say share proactively. I think whether you're an investor who thinks this is important and wants to do this analysis, or if you're a startup who works in this space, I think proactively sharing your potential impact and any measurement you can do for that goes a long way. So we're more impressed when we see that when we first engage with a portfolio company. I think we feel like it differentiates us and everyone on this call in the market by putting our emphasis and stress on this. And I think it moves the entire community in the right direction. So I think independent of where you get to, making sure you're talking about that, I think it's important.
Trisha?
I like that. Thanks, Ted. I think the biggest advice for me is take it easy on yourself. I think a lot of the entrepreneurs that we work with are very A-type personalities, and perfectionism is at the heart of all of that, and often show up stressed, expecting to have all the answers. And these resources and people like us are out there to help through that process and through that thinking. And like Shambhur said, it's an exploration. It's a different language. And it's just being able to join on that and take it easy. And maybe, the KISS, that keep it simple, stupid kind of a thing. It's stay high level, stick with what you know, and try to stay out of those weeds and just kind of lean on people like us to help through that, or through the tools that are created.
All of that is beautiful advice. Thank you to the Clean Energy Ventures team, Shambhur and Ted, for joining us. And thank you, Trisha. I'm going to turn it back over to Miguel, our MC. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Joe, Trisha, Shambhur, and Ted. Better understanding, for me at least, on how the mechanisms are in place. And thank you for taking us behind the curtain. That was immensely helpful. I took away a lot of things, but I think those last three nuggets of share proactively and take it easy on yourself, and it really is a village that gets this up and running. So thank you all for being leaders in this space and being part of that village. All right, folks, we're moving and grooving. I got to give a shout out to Gilberto Gandra, who saw the YVR pillow back there on my chair. Thanks for keeping an eye on the rotating pillows. I give a shout out to great cities around the world that I've lived in and worked in. We are having another speed networking session happening right now, so you can meet other folks in the space. Come on back for the next section at 1:30 p.m. Pacific, or a minute early if you like to groove with that great music we've been hearing. Enjoy the networking session. See you soon.